Could I do a thing of personal privilege here and ask all the fathers in the house to stand for a moment? There must be some because we have all these kids here. Thank you, gentlemen. Because this gospel lesson is for you. And if you want to know how to be a good father, read Luke 15. Now, last week we did the other two lost and found stories, the sheep and the coin, but now we're getting to the hard stuff. Because most of us don't carry a lot of loose change anymore, and most of us don't raise sheep. Although I did discover there's someone here who knows sheep. And the more we know about sheep, the more we understand that Jesus is not exactly complimenting us when he talks about us as sheep. But this is even better. And this is a story we all know. And if you look in older editions of the Bible, those little italic things that tell you the name of the story, the older ones all say the prodigal son. Any of you grow up with that title for this story? Well, Christians have a habit of emphasizing the negative, and prodigal just means wasteful. But the new editions say the forgiving father. And that's the point of the story. It's not primarily about this younger son who wastes a lot, but it's really a story about a father. Put this down somewhere so I can more effectively gesticulate. One of my many bad habits. So, part one. This young man comes to his father and says, in effect, "You are dead to me. So I want my inheritance because you're dead." That's a great insult in the Hebrew world of the first century, but there you have it. Okay, Dad, since you're dead anyway, let me have my share of the inheritance. And of course, he goes off to another country, wastes it all, and I think it's nice the way they put it, desolate living. And we think a little, what is desolate living exactly like? Well, use your imagination. But then a wonderful thing happens. He runs out of money. Most of us would not think of that as a wonderful thing, but in his case it is, because only then does he come to his senses. So what has he been doing? Well, he's been visiting the girls in the bad part of town, and worse, he's been feeding pigs. This boy is Jewish. Pig feeding is not acceptable. So he comes to his senses, and he comes home to his father. And he has a speech ready to go. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your slaves." And he maybe is going over that in his head as he's walking home. And the father, think of the father, because the father apparently has been out there looking down the road every day. Day after day, he's waiting for this son to come back. But unlike the sheep, he doesn't go after him. And you read about, from time to time, someone whose son or daughter has run off to Las Vegas or something, and the father goes looking. Not this time. Father's looking down the highway. And finally, he sees the son coming. Now, the son had a chance to say to himself, oh, I'm in. I don't have to make the speech. But he makes it anyway. Second time we hear it in this passage. Father, I have sinned. It's a good example for all of us with our Heavenly Father, because from time to time, most of us sin and have to come to our Heavenly Father and say, Father, I have sinned. There's a wonderful thing in the Benedictine world. It's called Chapter of Faults. Everybody gets together, and you don't confess other people's faults. That's specifically prohibited. You confess your own faults. It's one of the Benedictine rules. You must never confess another's sin. You can only confess your own sins. Now, we Christians are pretty good at breaking that rule. We have a Bible study group on Thursdays, and we're great at pointing out everything that's wrong with society and so forth, confessing the sins of people that some of my brethren call the bar crowd. We know they're sinners, much more sinful than us. Really makes you feel good, you know. Somebody else outsins you. But what does the Father do? He orders his slaves to do three things. Everybody remember what they are? He gets the best robe in the house. Now that's something that goes to honored guests. He's going to be the guest of honor. And shoes. And that may not seem important because most of us wear shoes when we're invited out to dinner, but only slaves go barefoot. So he's rejecting this whole idea of make me a slave, because if he were going to be a slave, he wouldn't need shoes. So the slaves are ordered to put shoes on the feet of the returning son. And finally, the ring. And that is probably a signet ring. Gives the son the right to do the family business. Kind of like handing him the American Express Platinum card and say, welcome home. Pretty gutsy thing for dad to do, don't you think? So, the story moves on. The older son is out in the field and didn't get the memo. But he hears, gosh, Dad's hired a band. And apparently it's pretty loud because he hears the music and the dancing. And he says to one of the slaves, what's happening? Now, something worth noting, a little sidebar here, whenever the oldest son talks about this youngster, he refers to him as your son. But when the father talks about him to the older son, it's your brother. Read between the lines. What in the world is going on here? A little sibling rivalry, maybe? No, it's worse than that. Now, the father goes out and tells the older son to come to the party. And he refuses. Why? jealousy, hostility. Who knows what's in his head? But he is not coming to a party for his stupid younger brother who has gone out and blown a big portion of the family fortune in that desolate living. So who is the big sinner? Well, we've given it away now, but for those of you who did bring your Talmud, if some of you did, we could go. And this is sort of buried in the book of Leviticus as well. But for various offenses, you would be ritually unclean, as not welcome in the temple. So, prostitutes, no big deal, 3 days. Pigs are worse. So for messing around with pigs, 10 days. For disobeying your father, 40 days. So who is the big sinner here? And do any of us ever sin as the older brother sinned? The sin of disobedience to your father. That's the big sin. So who's the big sinner? Well, we've given it away now. But if you want to do the math, it's obviously the older brother. Now, we have a nun friend of the monastery we're associated with who, poor woman, got transferred to Hawaii. But anyway, New Mexico to Hawaii. But she used the phrase one day, she said, "I've been older brothering again." Then I got thinking about it. Sometimes I'm guilty of older brothering. Maybe some of you are. Do we ever fail to obey not just our earthly father, but our heavenly Father? So what is the message to us? What do we take away for ourselves from this story? Brotherhood and sisterhood is a lot bigger than we think it is. This older brother doesn't think he has to obey his father. He doesn't have to celebrate the good fortune of his younger brother. Do you believe this, kid? I have never disobeyed your command. Anybody believe that? Of course not. None of us grow up without ever disobeying our fathers. You fathers who stood up may have had that experience from your own children. And all of us are children of somebody, and all of us are related because we are children of God. And that's all we need to be. Really, child of God is the only title we need. Most of us have some others and have pride in them and so forth, but child of God is the most important thing we are. And if we recognize our childishness, we can be better parents. Now, moving to the end, we have that long lesson. Take that home with you. It's Father's Day. You gentlemen who stood up, look at the example of the forgiving Father, because forgiveness is hard, but it's terribly important. We started some years back giving a retreat on forgiveness. It's called forgiveness, the power to heal. And when we first dreamed it up, we wanted to do it far from home in case the word got back, and it was a total failure. So we went to Iowa. Nobody gossips in Iowa. To a Catholic retreat house, kind enough to invite us. And it worked really well. And people talked about, until I put that burden of unforgiveness down for something that happened years ago, I was just always carrying this thing. And maybe some of you are. And if someone comes and asks for your forgiveness, for God's sake, that's chosen on purpose. For God's sake, forgive them, because that has the power to heal them and you. I have a little small example of that. When a friend many, many years ago came to us, called first, announced that he had joined AA, and he was to go and seek forgiveness for anyone who had wronged. And he said, well, I behaved very badly at a party at your house years ago and would like to ask your forgiveness. And I stupidly said, oh, it's no big deal, it was a small window. That's not what he needed. He needed acceptance and forgiveness. So what's the example of the forgiving Father? Acceptance, welcome home, and forgiveness. We must rejoice. And he says to the older son, we had to rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and is now alive. And when we get that opportunity, one way or another, most of us do, to say to someone, I forgive you, welcome home. By God's grace, may we do it. Will you pray with me?